Grief is a funny thing. It doesn't just crush you, it changes the shape of the world around you. When my husband David died suddenly in a tragic construction accident 2 years ago, my world didn't just stop. It shattered into a million painful, jagged pieces. And the only thing holding me together, the only tangible piece of David I had left, was the heavy brass urn on my mantelpiece. Inside that urn were his ashes. It wasn't just dust, it was David. It was the promise of a future we'd planned, the memory of his laugh, his scent, his touch. It was sacred. I had always had a complicated relationship with my mother-in-law, Barbara. David was her only child, and she was fiercely possessive. While David was alive, she treated me with a sort of cold, polite disdain, the woman who stole her son. After he died, her attitude shifted to a strange, competitive grief. She saw David's death as a personal tragedy that somehow outweighed mine. She moved into our guest room a week after the funeral, claiming she couldn't bear the thought of her son's house being empty. It was an invasion disguised as comfort. Suddenly, my safe haven became her territory. Barbara was obsessed with appearances and social standing. She was constantly complaining about her small, cramped condo and her life as a single woman. She'd always felt she deserved more, and David's death, rather than humbling her, seemed to intensify her entitlement. The constant tension between us revolved entirely around the urn. I kept the urn on the mantelpiece in the living room. Barbara insisted it was morbid and should be relegated to the attic. "It's not healthy, Clara," she'd sigh, gesturing dismissively at the brass container. "It's time to let go." "He's gone. You need to move on." "He's right here, Barbara," I would reply, my voice tight with restraint. "This is where he stays until I decide where to scatter him. And that decision is mine." The truth was, I hadn't scattered his ashes because I wasn't ready to say the final goodbye. The urn was a security blanket, a silent companion during those brutally lonely nights. Barbara, however, saw the urn as an obstacle to my recovery, and more importantly, an obstacle to her comfort. She started trying to subtly remove it. One day, it would be moved behind a large vase. The next, it would be tucked onto a bookshelf with a pile of old books. Every time, I would silently move it back to its place of honor. It became a cold war waged over a few square inches of mantelpiece. This went on for months. Our entire life was a strained silence punctuated by her passive-aggressive attempts to control my grief. She'd constantly tell me I was too young to be a widow, that I needed to find a new man and unburden myself from David's memory. "I found a lovely, respectable man at my bridge club, Clara," she announced one evening over dinner. "He's an accountant. Very stable. You should let him take you out." "I am not interested, Barbara," I said, putting my fork down. "I am still married to David, in my heart." Her eyes narrowed. "Nonsense. Dead is dead. You need to focus on the living, Clara. And frankly, David's memory is holding you back." I knew her obsession with me moving on was really an obsession with her having full control over the house and potentially getting a piece of the insurance money, which I was using to pay the mortgage and keep us afloat. Then came the moment that, in retrospect, was the beginning of the end. Barbara announced she was going to buy a house. "I'm tired of renting, Clara," she declared, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "I found the most exquisite little cottage in Willow Creek. 2 bedrooms, a proper garden, perfect for entertaining. I just need a significant down payment, and I'm going to make it happen. The problem was Barbara was retired and lived on a modest pension. She had no significant savings. "That's wonderful, Barbara," I said, trying to sound supportive. "How are you planning to fund the down payment?" She waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, I have a few investments. Some creative ways of generating capital. Don't you worry your pretty head about it." A few days later, a strange man showed up at the house while I was at work. Barbara rushed him into the guest room, and they spent an hour talking in hushed, conspiratorial tones. When I got home, the man was gone, and Barbara was jittery, her eyes unnaturally bright. "Who was that?" I asked casually. "Just a financial advisor," she lied too quickly, "helping me liquidate some assets for the house." "Nothing you need to concern yourself with." I felt a sudden, sharp spike of suspicion. The secrecy, the jittery excitement, the blatant lie about a financial advisor. It didn't feel right. The true nightmare, however, began a week later. I got home from work utterly exhausted and walked straight into the living room. I tossed my keys onto the hall table, took off my coat, and looked toward the mantelpiece, the place I looked at 100 times a day for comfort. My heart immediately plummeted into my stomach. The urn was gone. The heavy brass urn that contained the cremated remains of my late husband, David, was no longer on the mantel. In its place, sitting innocently, was a small, dusty porcelain statuette of a shepherdess that Barbara usually kept on her bedside table. I froze, convinced I was hallucinating from exhaustion. I frantically searched the room. Under the couch, behind the curtains, inside the storage cabinet, nothing. I stormed into Barbara's guest room. She was sitting in bed, reading a novel, looking utterly serene. "Barbara, where is the urn?" I demanded, my voice raw with panic. She looked up, feigning mild surprise. "The urn, dear." "Oh, I moved it. I told you, it's morbid. It was starting to collect dust in a dreadful way. I put it somewhere safe." "Where, Barbara?" "Where is David?" I screamed, the control I'd maintained for months shattering completely. "Calm down, Clara. It's just dust. I put it in the attic in a box labeled Christmas decorations. Now stop being dramatic." I ran up to the attic, tearing through boxes, ripping the tops off containers labeled ornaments and lights. I found a box labeled miscellaneous memorabilia. I opened it. Inside there were old photos, Leo's baby clothes, and some random trinkets. No urn. I rushed back downstairs, tears blinding me. "It's not there. Barbara, tell me the truth. What did you do with David?" She stood up from her bed, her face hardening into a terrifying mask of cold indifference. "I did what I had to do, Clara," she hissed, her voice low and chilling. "I made my down payment, and you need to stop living in the past and start focusing on your future." I stared at her, the words forming a sickening knot in my throat. You didn't sell it, did you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Tell me you didn't sell David's ashes." Barbara didn't answer with words. She just pulled a small, pristine bank statement out of her pajama drawer. The recent deposit, labeled Private Asset Liquidation, was highlighted in yellow. It was a sum that matched the down payment for the house she wanted. The sickening realization hit me. She had used the ashes of her own son as a commodity. My vision blurred with a mix of blinding rage and utter, paralyzing disbelief. I stood in the doorway of Barbara's guest room, staring at the smug look on her face and the highlighted bank statement. The sum was $35,000. That was the exact down payment needed for the cottage in Willow Creek she'd been raving about. "You sold him?" I choked out, the words tasting like ash. You sold your own son? What kind of monster are you, Barbara? Barbara didn't flinch. She tucked the bank statement back into her drawer with a satisfied air. Her cold indifference was far more terrifying than any hysterics. Don't be dramatic, Clara, she said, smoothing the duvet. It wasn't him. It was just dust. And that dust was doing nothing but collecting bad energy on your mantelpiece. I simply liquidated an underutilized asset to secure my future. An underutilized asset, I screamed, taking a step toward her. That was my husband. That was the last piece of David I had. How could you possibly... I did it because David would have wanted me to be comfortable. She cut me off, her voice suddenly rising in defense. He worried about me constantly. You have the house, the car, and the insurance money. I was left with nothing. It was an equitable distribution. And frankly, Clara, it took me a lot of creative networking to find the right buyer. The word buyer sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. A buyer for human remains. This wasn't just theft, it was desecration. Who bought him, Barbara? I demanded, my hands clenched into fists. Where are the ashes? Who pays $35,000 for a person's remains? What are they going to use them for? Barbara paused, a flicker of genuine anxiety crossing her face. She hesitated, knowing this final piece of information would absolutely shatter me. It was complicated, she finally admitted, lowering her voice. The man who came here, Mr. Thorne, he represents a private collector. They buy remains of people who died suddenly, violently, and are young. Why? I pleaded, trying to cling to a shred of sanity. A collector of what? She sighed as if explaining a tedious financial regulation. They're called memento vitae collectors. They believe that certain tragically cut short lives retain a special spiritual potency. They use the ashes for various things. Some mix them into paint for macabre art. Some fashion them into very exclusive high-end jewelry, mourning mementos. The image of David's ashes being worn as a ghoulish piece of jewelry or smeared onto a canvas made me physically sick. It was a violation far worse than I could have imagined. This wasn't a standard black market transaction. It was a deeply disturbing niche market for the sacred remains of the dead. You sold your son's remnants to a ghoul, I shouted, staggering back. You traded David's memory for a 2-bedroom cottage. I'm calling the police. Barbara immediately sprang into full crisis mode, her composure finally breaking. She knew this was beyond a petty family dispute. No, Clara, wait! She grabbed my arm. Think about this. This is not just theft. This is grave robbery. If this goes to the police, the media will destroy us. David's memory will be dragged through the mud as a sold asset. They'll question the legitimacy of the cremation, the funeral home. It will be a scandal. And I'll tell them you knew about the black market value of the ashes all along. Her threat was a sharp, calculated blow. She was using the potential public shame and the inevitable desecration of David's name as leverage. She knew I would do anything to protect the dignity of his memory, even if the ashes themselves were already desecrated. I pulled away from her, dialing 911 anyway. But before I could speak, Barbara lunged for my phone, knocking it out of my hand. The phone skittered across the floor, breaking the call connection. Listen to me, she yelled, her eyes wild. I can get them back. Mr. Thorne told me the transfer takes a few weeks. I can cancel the sale. I just need to return the money. Where is the money, Barbara? You made the down payment. I put a hold on the cottage, she confessed, tears finally streaming down her face. Tears not of regret, but of panic. I gave them the money, but the contract isn't finalized until next week. I can cancel the wire transfer if I act fast, but you cannot call the police. The panic was genuine. She wasn't scared of my wrath. She was scared of prison and the loss of her down payment. I looked down at the phone, then back at the frantic woman who was weeping over a financial loss, not a moral one. I had a choice: pursue justice and let the horrifying, ghoulish nature of David's death become a public spectacle, or try to recover his remains, however sullied the process would be. The answer was immediate and absolute. I had to get David back. "Fine," I hissed, picking up the phone and holding it tightly. "No police, yet. But you have exactly 48 hours to reverse that transaction, get that $35,000 back, and return the money to Mr. Thorne. Then you will tell me exactly where David is. And if you don't, I said, my voice cold and lethal, I will call the police, the media, and every single person you know, and I will tell them you sold your own son to a cult to buy a house, and I will make sure you spend the rest of your life in a cell." The next 48 hours were a blur of intense, nerve-wracking espionage. I tracked Barbara like a hawk. I forced her to call the real estate agent to cancel the contract, fabricating a story about sudden illness. I watched her log into the bank and reverse the wire transfer, the $35,000 returning to her account, an obscene, ill-gotten sum. But the hardest part was the final negotiation with Mr. Thorne. Barbara was too scared, so I took the lead. I called the number she provided, reaching a man with a surprisingly smooth, professional voice. "Mr. Thorne, this is Clara, David Peterson's wife," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The deal is off. We need the remains returned immediately." He chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "I'm afraid that's complicated, Mrs. Peterson." "The asset is already with the client. It's been prepared for the eternal memento process. The client is highly invested." "I don't care about your client," I snapped. "You're dealing with stolen property. If you do not return the ashes, I will contact law enforcement, and I will personally ensure that your entire operation is exposed." He paused. "Exposure is bad for business," I concede. "Very well. The client hasn't fully taken possession yet. But my time and the client's investment are not free, Mrs. Peterson. To reverse this, you must pay a cancellation fee of $10,000. My jaw dropped. They were demanding a ransom for my own husband's remains. Barbara, standing beside me, looked panicked. "I don't have $10,000 to waste on a bribe," I whispered fiercely to her. "I do," Barbara hissed back, pointing frantically at the $35,000 in her account. "It's the money I got from selling him." "Use it." The horrific irony of the situation hit me. I had to use the money Barbara gained from selling David's ashes to buy him back from the black market. It was the most corrupt transaction I had ever conceived, but it was the only way. The moment I transferred the $10,000 back to Mr. Thorne, I felt a deep, sickening wave of self-loathing. I had engaged in a criminal transaction, paying a ransom to protect the sanctity of my late husband's memory. But the relief of potentially getting David back quickly overshadowed the shame. Mr. Thorne, true to his word, arranged the return. It wasn't a formal delivery. It was a discreet drop-off at a public storage unit 40 miles away. I drove there alone, Barbara too terrified to come, still under house surveillance by my watchful eye. Finding the storage unit, I unlocked the designated box. Inside, there was a plain, unmarked wooden crate. My hands trembled as I opened it. The familiar brass urn was there. My heart leaped with a frantic surge of hope until I lifted it. It felt immediately, startlingly lighter. I opened the lid, my breath catching in my throat. The original urn felt heavy because it was nearly full. This one was only half full. The ashes had been tampered with. Mr. Thorne's client hadn't just placed a hold on the asset. They had taken a substantial portion. They had already begun the eternal memento process. They had sampled my husband. A cold, absolute despair washed over me. I wasn't just getting David back. I was getting the leftovers of a ghoulish, failed transaction. But seeing the familiar brass urn, even half empty, was a small, crucial victory. I locked the crate and drove home, the remaining ashes secured on the passenger seat. When I walked back into the house, Barbara was waiting in the living room, wringing her hands, tears dried to streaks on her cheeks. "Is he back? Did you get him?" she asked, rushing toward the crate. "Yes," I said, placing the crate on the coffee table, "but you need to look at what you did, Barbara." I opened the crate and lifted the urn. Barbara immediately noticed the difference. "Why is it so light? Where is the rest of him?" she whispered, finally sounding genuinely horrified. "Mr. Thorne's client already started the eternal memento process," I explained, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "They took a portion. They desecrated David's remains to the tune of $10,000. That's the cancellation fee we paid. The other $25,000 is sitting in your account right now." I looked her straight in the eye. "You sold your son's dignity for a house, Barbara. And now you will pay for it." The next few hours were dedicated to my carefully planned retribution. I knew going to the police was still too risky. The scandal would still destroy David's memory publicly. My revenge had to be surgical and contained within the family's financial domain. Barbara's greatest weakness. I made her sign a document handwritten on a legal pad, witnessed by a notary I brought to the house under false pretenses. "This document," I explained, pushing the pen into her trembling hand, "states that you are voluntarily transferring the entire $25,000 remaining from the fraudulent sale back to my account as repayment for the $10,000 ransom and for the emotional damages caused." She whimpered. "But that was my down payment. I'll have nothing left." "You should have thought of that before you sold your son," I retorted. "Sign it." She signed. The money was wired back to my account, a tainted, ill-gotten sum that I immediately put into a separate, untouched savings account. But the financial punishment wasn't enough. The psychological severance was required. "You are moving out, Barbara," I stated firmly, "immediately. You have 24 hours to pack your bags and leave this house. Your presence here is a constant physical reminder of the most repulsive betrayal I have ever experienced." "But where will I go?" "I have nowhere to go. You know I hate my old condo." "That is no longer my concern," I said. "You chose a house over your son's remains. Now you get neither. You used your son's death to finance your life, and now you will live your life alone." I contacted David's father, my ex-father-in-law, to explain the situation. He was shocked but supportive of my actions. He agreed to help her find temporary accommodation, but refused to finance her extravagant lifestyle. He was disgusted by her actions, which was a huge validation. Barbara tried every trick in the book. crocodile tears, dramatic fainting spells, and threats to call the family lawyer. I simply stood my ground, holding the urn, the half-empty urn, as my witness. The next day, Barbara left. She was forced to sell the expensive furniture she had bought in anticipation of her new cottage and return to the cramped, modest condo she despised. She went from being the privileged mother of a deceased son to a woman whose greatest asset, the memory of David, was permanently corrupted by her own greed. The silence in the house after she left was deafening, but it was a healing silence. I could breathe again. My next step was the most difficult, dealing with the remnants. The fact that a portion of David's remains was out there, possibly molded into a piece of bizarre jewelry or mixed into paint, was a permanent violation. I knew I couldn't scatter the remaining ashes now. It would be a surrender, an admission that David was incomplete. Instead, I took the original brass urn, melted down the $25,000 Barbara returned to me, and commissioned a renowned artist to create a beautiful bronze sculpture, a tribute to David. I used the ashes to fill a small hidden compartment within the heavy, permanent sculpture. The sculpture was not David, but it was a permanent, dignified container for what was left of him. It sat on the mantelpiece, a silent, powerful guard against any future attempt at desecration. The rest of the money I donated to a foundation that helped families dealing with construction accidents. I cleansed the money of its corrupt origin. The physical urn was gone, replaced by a monument, but the emotional scar of the black market transaction remained. I knew I would never truly be the same person. The trust was shattered, not just in Barbara, but in the depths of human selfishness. After Barbara was forced out of the house, a fragile peace settled over my life. The new bronze sculpture, housing David's remaining ashes, sat majestically on the mantel, a silent sentinel against the darkness. I had successfully contained the immediate damage and protected David's memory from public scandal. But Barbara was not one to fade quietly into her cramped condo. She viewed her forced exile and the loss of her down payment as an unparalleled injustice, and she was determined to retaliate. 2 months after she left, the story hit the local media, but not in the way I feared. It wasn't about the black market sale of human remains. It was a distorted, wicked version of the truth, leaked directly by Barbara to a sensationalist gossip column. The headline screamed, "Greedy widow hoards husband's ashes," "Forces bereaved mother-in-law out of her home after financial dispute." The article painted me as the villain, a cold, controlling woman who stole the entire insurance payout and was emotionally abusing her grieving, elderly mother-in-law by forcing her to leave the family home. Barbara claimed I had insisted on keeping David's ashes as a trophy to prevent her from moving on and accused me of hoarding the funeral money. She cleverly omitted the black market, the $35,000 down payment, and the $10,000 ransom. She twisted the truth just enough to make me look monstrously selfish. The public reaction was immediate and vicious. People who knew us, neighbors, David's old colleagues, even some distant family, started posting comments online, criticizing my lack of compassion for Barbara. I received hate mail and nasty phone calls, all echoing Barbara's fabricated narrative. How could you throw out your late husband's mother? The smear campaign was Barbara's final desperate attempt at revenge, to inflict social punishment where she couldn't inflict criminal or financial punishment. She couldn't take my money or my home, so she tried to take my reputation. The stress was immense. I was already recovering from a devastating loss and a horrifying betrayal, and now I was forced to defend my character against a torrent of public judgment. I called David's father, who was furious with Barbara's actions. He told me that she had even tried to convince him to sue me for emotional distress caused by the eviction. "Don't worry about the gossip, Clara," he advised. "Everyone who truly knows Barbara knows she's unhinged and obsessed with money. But you need to decide if you want to fight this publicly." Fighting back meant revealing the truth. The black market sale, the ghoulish collectors, the $10,000 ransom. It meant exposing David's remains to the very public disgrace I had fought so hard to prevent. I decided silence was my best defense. I refused to confirm or deny the article. I pulled my social media accounts down, changed my phone number, and stopped answering the door. I chose to prioritize the sanctity of David's memory and my own peace over winning a public relations battle with a venomous woman. The only person I directly confronted was Barbara via a final cold email sent through her lawyer. "Your attempt to destroy my reputation has only confirmed the depth of your depravity. I protected David's memory from criminal scandal once. Do not test me again. If you leak one more detail or mention David's name publicly, I will be forced to reveal the full truth of the black market sale and the ransom, which will ensure you face criminal prosecution for grave desecration and fraud. Consider this your final warning. Live your life alone and in silence." The threat worked. Barbara understood the cold reality of criminal law, even if she refused to acknowledge moral law. The media frenzy slowly died down, replaced by the next sensational story. My life became quiet again, but deeply insulated. The experience taught me a profound lesson about the nature of family and ownership. I realized that my initial grief, my need to keep the urn on the mantle, was partly about satisfying the social expectation of grieving widow. Barbara's actions forced me to redefine my relationship with David's memory. The bronze sculpture on the mantelpiece was more than an urn. It was a symbol of my freedom. It was a tangible representation of the fact that David's true remains were in my heart and my memories, not in any brass container. His essence was unmarketable, untouchable, and forever protected from the greedy hands of his mother. I started seeing a grief counselor, not just for the loss of David, but for the trauma inflicted by Barbara. I talked through the sickening feeling of the $10,000 transfer, the horror of the half-empty urn, and the shame of the media coverage. It was a long, painful process of recognizing that I was not guilty for protecting myself, but a victim of a monstrous act. I returned to work, focused on renovating the house, and slowly began to rebuild my social life, but with walls up, constantly vigilant against any sign of the kind of financial desperation and emotional toxicity that had ruined my marriage and threatened my sanity. The quiet, unmarketable truth of the matter was that David's death brought out the worst in his mother, and in doing so, freed me from the obligation of ever having to pretend she was a good person. The final silence from Barbara was the truest gift I received after David's death. My life, once centered on the drama and expectations of the Peterson family, became singularly focused on my own well-being and future. I had paid a heavy emotional price for my freedom, but the resulting peace was absolute. I threw myself into my work and my hobbies. I started volunteering at a local animal shelter, a place where love was simple, honest, and unburdened by financial expectation. The house, which Barbara had tainted with her avarice, slowly transformed back into my sanctuary. I repainted the guest room, removing every trace of her presence, turning it into a home office filled with light and warmth. The most profound change was my relationship with the bronze sculpture on the mantelpiece. I stopped seeing it as a morbid symbol of David's death and started seeing it as a powerful monument to our love and my resilience. It represented the love that could not be sold, the memory that could not be desecrated, and the strength that could not be broken by greed. The media story eventually faded into obscurity. The few people who still dared to ask about poor Barbara were met with a calm, neutral wall. I simply stated that Barbara and I had different ideas about how to manage grief and that we had agreed to live separate lives. I never confirmed the black market sale. That horrifying truth remains my burden to bear and my triumph to hold. I did, however, find out the ultimate fate of Barbara, thanks to an update from David's father, Mark, who still occasionally checked on her out of obligation. Barbara was unable to sustain her lifestyle in the expensive condo without the down payment money and without David's financial shadow to protect her. She quickly burned through the meager savings she had left trying to maintain appearances. Eventually, she was forced to move again, this time to a small, subsidized apartment complex outside the city, a place far beneath the social status she craved and fought so desperately to maintain. Mark told me that she had become intensely isolated. Her few remaining friends, who only cared about her bridge club status and social standing, dropped her after the public smear campaign. She lived alone, constantly complaining about her lack of funds, and still, apparently, railing against me for stealing her chance at happiness. Her punishment was not the 4 years in prison I once desired, but a far more fitting and profound justice, a life of complete self-imposed financial and social exile, achieved entirely through her own reckless greed. She had sacrificed the most sacred bond, the memory of her own son, for a monetary gain that she ultimately failed to secure. I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only a quiet confirmation that justice, in its own karmic way, often prevails. She spent the rest of her life paying the high price of her avarice, while I spent mine building true, unpurchasable peace. 2 years after the final chaos, I met someone new. His name is Alex. He is kind, stable, and deeply understanding. When I told him the simplified version of my past, the loss of David and the subsequent devastating family drama, he listened without judgment. I didn't tell him the story of the black market and the $10,000 ransom until we were deeply serious, months later. When I finally confessed the full gruesome truth, the sampling of the ashes, the black market collector, the transfer of the blood money, I watched his face, ready for the inevitable disgust or fear. But Alex just took my hand. "You fought a monster to save the soul of the man you loved, Clara," he said gently. "You are the bravest person I know. You chose dignity over convenience. That's a moral victory." His reaction was the final moment of validation I needed. It confirmed that my choices, however dark and legally questionable, were made from a place of love and protection, not greed or malice. The brass urn, the stolen half-empty vessel, I eventually retrieved it from the storage unit, melted it down, and mixed the metal into the base of the bronze sculpture. It was a symbolic act. The container of the crime was transformed into the foundation of the monument. So, why am I telling you this? Why am I reliving this nightmare? Because I want people to understand that grief is not currency. I want you to know that sometimes the people closest to you, the ones you rely on for emotional support, are the ones most capable of weaponizing your vulnerability for their own financial gain. Barbara didn't see a grieving daughter-in-law. She saw an opportunity to liquidate a sacred asset. If you are going through loss, protect your finances, protect your privacy, and protect your boundaries. Trust your instincts. If a family member's grief seems too competitive, too calculating, or too focused on material possessions, run. I lost my husband, but I refused to let his memory be sold on the black market. I fought for his dignity, and in doing so, I secured my own. And that quiet, ordinary life I have now, the one free from the shadow of Julian and the greed of Barbara, it is the most valuable thing I own. It is a peace I earned, one painful step at a time, and no black market collector can ever put a price on that. Thank you for listening to this difficult confession. We are so grateful to share these stories with you. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments section below.